So in the last video, we talked about how to target specific HTML inside our CSS file so we could actually style it. And in this video, we're going to talk about how to actually do styling and actually change the content to make our website look pretty. So what I did here is I have a completely fresh website. As you can see, we just have a H1 and a paragraph tag. And what I want to do here is I want to go inside my paragraph tag and I want to give this one a class so we can actually target it using CSS. So I'm going to say class is equal to double quotes. And then I'm going to call this one main P, which is the main paragraph inside the website. Now, what I want to do here is I want to go inside my main.css file, and I want to say I want to target a class by using punctuation called main-p, and then curly brackets. Now, inside the curly brackets, I want to actually add some styling. And when it comes to text specifically inside the website, there's many different types of stylings you can apply to them. And we're just gonna go ahead and cover a lot of them in this episode here. And I will, of course, leave timestamps below so you can scroll back and forward to actually see the different types of stylings really fast if you want to return to this video here. But for now, we're just gonna go ahead and go through them one by one. So the first thing I'm going to show you is how to actually add a styling. And the way we do that is by writing a keyword to whatever we want to actually style inside the website. And then we write a colon followed by a semicolon. And in between these two, we write the value of what we need to change. So for example, if I want to change a color of this particular text here, I write color, colon, semicolon, and then right before the semicolon, I write whatever needs to be changed. So in this case here, I could, for example, say I want to write the hex color for white. So I could say hashtag FFF, which is a white color. And this would actually go ahead and change my text into being white. So if we were to go back inside my website and just refresh it here, you can now see it's white. So we can't really see it here, but it is here because I can actually highlight it inside the website. We could also give it any other kind of color. So you could, of course, write, instead of a hexadecimal, you could say blue. This would actually change it to a blue color. There is some preset colors in here, so you can just write the name for the color. We don't usually use it unless it's for testing purposes, but typically you would use a hexadecimal. As you can actually see, it actually gives you the hexadecimal on the side here. If you don't know how to find hexadecimals, this right here is a website called color.adobe.com. It is completely free. You can just type it in and then you can pick colors with it. But essentially you can go in here and you can pick a color. So you can say, well, I want this particular color over here. Copy the hexadecimal, go back inside your styling and just say hashtag and then that particular hexadecimal number. And then you can see it actually changes here. So with that, we can go inside our website, refresh it, and now you can see we get that particular color. Now inside this particular editor here, you can actually go up and actually highlight the little box here with the color in it. And then you can go down and you can pick another color if you wanted to. And that's just because this particular editor here can do that. So with that, you can just pick something, save it, go back inside your website, and then you can see it changes to that particular color there. So in this particular case here, we just changed the color of a piece of text. What you can also do, if you go down to the next line, is actually change anything about the font. So if we write font, dash, you can actually see we get a bunch of suggestions here that you can actually choose. The most typical ones is that, for example, we want to change the font family. So we can choose a different font type. For example, if you're using, Times New Roman, or if you're using Arial, Georgia, different types of fonts, then you can do that and you can just sort of like pick one here. Now you will notice that if I pick one of these, let's take Arial, for example, it is actually going to give me different types of fonts followed by a comma, which means that we have Arial, Helvetica, and sans serif. Now, the thing about this is if a particular browser does not support Arial, then it's going to skip to Helvetica. If the browser doesn't support that one, then it's going to jump to the next one. And this is just kind of a safeguard in that sort of sense. Now, typically, whenever I pick a font, I use a custom font off the internet, which I will also show you how to do in a later episode. For now, we're just going to use the default ones that we have available to us inside the text editor and not use any sort of custom fonts. If I were to save this, go inside my website here, you can see that now, well, actually, you can't really see it because it's very, it's very small and it's very, let's address that now. If I go inside my text editor and say instead of this, green color, I'm going to go ahead and change it to red because that one we can actually see. And I'm also going to go ahead and change the font size which I could actually go ahead and say, well, right now it's actually giving me large, larger, medium, small, but that's not really what we want here. I'm going to go ahead and say 70 pixel. And before people start saying anything in the comments, we do also have something called EM or SEM, which is another way of sizing things when it comes to fonts inside the website. We're not going to talk about that quite yet. We're just going to go and talk about pixels for now. Then we'll get to the other ones later on, because that's a whole other subject in itself and an entire new video just for that particular thing. So for now, we're going to use pixels, okay? So if I were to go ahead and save this, go inside my browser, you can actually see that now we can actually see the text. And this is Arial, by the way, as a font. I know we didn't really see the change there, but this is Arial. This is a different font than the default one that we have up here. I don't know if you can kind of tell this, but you can kind of see that the P's don't look the same. So it's two different fonts. So the next one we're going to talk about is going to be font-weight. And this is something we use in order to make a font very thin or very bold. So for example, if I choose 1 here, or 100, it's called, go inside my browser, refresh it, you can see that now it looks like this, which is the same. But if I were to go ahead and pick something larger, let's say 900, go inside the browser, refresh, you can now see it becomes bold, because that is what the font weight does. Let's actually go and change that back to 100, just because I think that looks a little bit nicer. And the next one we're going to talk about is going to be the font style. So we're going to say font style. You can now see that we get italic, normal, oblique, you know, different types of stylings here. So we're to pick italic just for this example here. Save it, go inside my browser. You can now see that it's italic. For the next one, we're going to talk about the text styling. So if I were to go down to the next line and write text-align, then we can actually align the text to a particular place inside the browser. So do I want it to be on the left side, which is down here, on the right side of my screen? Let's actually go and pick right for now and just go and save that and go inside the browser. Now you can see it actually aligns to the right side over here. If we were to go back down and say instead I want to center it, then it's going to get centered inside the website. So it's going to be in the middle. So we can also change the text in itself right there. We can go down and say we also want to add a text decoration, which right now could be dashed, dotted, double, line through. Basically, this is going to be, you know, decoration on top of the text. So it could, for example, be a line through, and that would be having a dash just going through the entire paragraph. We can also change this to underline. So if we say underline, then it's going to have an underline underneath the actual text here. We can also go ahead and say text transform, which is going to allow for us to capitalize, lowercase, uppercase, you know, or none, in case you want to do that, which basically means that we can say, if I wrote something, for example, this paragraph over here, as you can see right now, we have a capitalized T, and then it's just small letters all the way through. Then in this case here, I can say uppercase, and that would actually go ahead and make everything uppercase. Now let's just go ahead and set this one to something else. We don't want to have uppercase in this example, so let's say none. The next one I want to show is something called line height, which is something that is going to allow for you to actually, you know, increase and decrease the spacing between the paragraph lines. So let's say you have a paragraph that goes down to the next line, and I can actually demonstrate this. Let's say we have a line height of, you know, something very small. So let's say 50 pixels. Which is very small compared to that we have a font size of 70 pixels. So if I were to go back inside my HTML document and just copy paste this paragraph a couple of times after each other, just so we have something that goes down to the next line, I can actually go ahead, refresh it here, and then you can see, oh, well, it's very close together, like it's very cramped. So we can go back inside and say, I instead want a 78 pixel line height. Go back inside the browser, and now I can see everything looks a little bit neater inside the browser there. We do also have something called word spacing, or word wrap in this case here, which is also going to allow for the words to jump down to the next line in some cases. But let's go ahead and pick the one called word spacing. So if I were to say I want to add a 50 pixel spacing in between words, then this is going to be quite a bit of spacing. So it's going to be a lot of space between them. Now let's go ahead and delete all these extra paragraph text pieces here. And let's go ahead and talk a bit about how to style boxes inside the website, because this is how we can style text. But what about boxes? So if I were to go down and create a div box inside my website and say I want to give this some sort of class name, so we can say class is equal to test-div, then I can take this name, go inside my CSS file, and say I want to say I have a class called test-div, curly brackets. Now, right now, it doesn't really have a width or a height. If I were to actually go ahead and save this and go inside my browser, you can actually see there's actually no box in here, you know, because there's nothing down here. But if I were to go back inside my styling and say that I have a width of a certain, let's say 100 pixels, and I do also have a height for this box, which could also be a 100 pixels. And if I were to save this, go inside the website, we still will not see anything. And that's because we need to have a background color in order to actually see it. So if we were to go down, add a background color and just choose something, we can just choose a aquamarine color here because we're fancy. Then I can go back inside the website, and now you can actually see we have a box over here on the left side, which is 100 pixels width and height. Now we do also have something called minimum width and maximum width, and minimum height and maximum height. Let's not talk about that for now. You can look it up if you want to skip ahead a little bit. For now, we're just going to talk about width and height. I think that's a good idea for now, since we're doing so much CSS in this one video here. But the next thing I want to talk a bit about is margins. Now, margins is something that is essentially spacing inside our website. If I were to go down and say I have a margin dash top of 200 pixels and save this, it means that I'm creating space at the top part of this particular box here, which means that I'm actually pushing the box away from this text up here. So if I were to refresh it, you can see that I move my box down. And we can do the same thing when it comes to moving it to the right side or the left side. So I can say margin, margin dash left, and let's give it 200 pixels. Then you can also see that we move it out from the left side of the website. So now it's moved out 200 pixels. By the way, if I'm moving things a lot more than you are when you're sitting here doing this example with me, it's because I zoomed in inside the browser. Like, this is how it would normally look like, but because it's a bit tiny for you to see, I just went ahead and zoomed in so you could actually see things. There's also another way we can write margins. And if I were to just go and delete these that I just created, I can say margin without any dashes. So we could say colon and semicolon. And inside of here, the way you would count this is top right bottom left. So I can say 200 pixels from the top, and I could say 0 pixels or just 0 because we don't have anything. So just without the pixels, and 0 from the bottom, and then 200 pixels from the left side. Actually, let's go ahead and change this to 3, just so we can actually see a change inside the website. So if I were to save this, go inside the website, you can now see that we moved the box again, but it's moving it from the top, right, bottom, left. Now let's go ahead and change this down to 200 again, just to, so it doesn't disappear down at the bottom of the website. So if I were to go ahead and save that and just refresh, the next thing I want to talk about is padding. Now, padding is slightly different from margins because right now we're creating space to the sides. But padding is when we actually add a padding outside the actual container. So if we were to change margin to padding and go inside my website, you can now see that we actually extend the box here. And you might be thinking, okay, but we didn't make the box larger, so why did it become larger? Now, like I said, margin is creating space, whereas padding is when we create an extra padding on the box. So essentially, and this is something you can do in modern browsers, by the way, you can actually go ahead and right click inside the browser, click inspect, which is the one at the bottom here. And then you'll actually see how a website looks like in the front end inside this little window here. So basically you can actually go in and see, how the HTML of a website looks like. So you can actually do this to find errors. If you wrote an error inside your HTML, this is a good way to find bugs and that kind of thing. But essentially, if I were to actually highlight the div box that we just created here, you can actually see, and I can't move my mouse because then it's going to disappear, but you can actually see that we have a green box on the left side, which is the padding that we just created. Then we have the little box down there that is blue, that is the actual box that we have inside the website. You can actually see when I highlight the div that we created that it actually tells us with the color schemes over here that we have a padding on the left and the top side. And a padding is basically another way of creating space, but we also kind of extend the container that we're inside of to push it away as we do it. So basically it's like it's not just creating spacing like this, but it's extending itself to create the spacing, which may sound a little bit weird, but in some cases, margins don't really work out, so we might have to use paddings instead to do this. Let's go ahead and move on. We'll probably get to use some examples later on where we can, talk about the differences between the two. So going back inside our CSS file, the next thing I want to talk a bit about is going to be something called float. Now, float means that we can actually make things go next to each other, because you may have noticed something up until now. Let's actually go ahead and not center the text that we have up here. Now, you may notice something, which is that we talked about hierarchy in the last episode, that the website is being read from top to bottom, which means that the HTML inside your file is being read from top to bottom. So right now we have the H1 tag first, then we have the paragraph tag, and then we have the div box, which is the same way that we have it inside the HTML file. So how can we put things next to each other? And this is where we start getting into different things, because one way of doing so, and the way that we used to do it all the time before HTML5 introduced some other ways of doing it, is using something called float. So if I were to go ahead and say that I want to go inside my text up here, and I want to float left, and what is going to happen now is that we're actually telling the text that we want to put it next to other content inside the web page. And something weird is going to happen now once I actually refresh the browser, because I only added the float left to my text here, which means that any content that comes after is actually going to ignore this particular piece of content, because I'm telling this one to float, but not the content that comes after. And it may sound weird, but if I were to go ahead and go inside the browser here, refresh it, you can now see that this particular content here is going to float left, and any content that comes afterwards is just going to ignore this piece of content then. So going back inside our styling, I can actually copy the float left to my box down here, and because they now both have the styling, they're not going to ignore each other anymore, but they're actually going to go ahead and jump next to each other. So we can actually place content next to each other in this kind of way. And there's a couple of things I need to mention here, which is that we did see that if I were to go ahead and actually copy this div box one more time, let's say I just put it, right after it, but I can call this one test 2 and just go ahead and copy paste this one down here, call it test 2 and give it a different color. And let's not actually have this one float. So with this particular styling here, we have two div boxes. One is blue and one is red. But the difference is one is not going to float, which means that it's just going to ignore these two pieces of content, the paragraph and the blue box, and just ignore them and just jump up and go below them. Let's not worry too much about divs for now, because float is something that you're going to use not as frequently today as you used to do in the past, because we do have newer technology today that we use in order to put things next to each other inside websites that is just much better than using float. It's kind of like an old-fashioned way of doing things, but it's still something we use occasionally whenever we need two pieces of content to go next to each other. So for now, just know that float is going to put things next to each other, and we will get to talk a bit about in a couple of episodes from now. We will use float, and I will talk about why we're going to use float in that particular example. For now, just know it puts things next to each other. I can see my face cam is starting to cover up CSS styling, so let's be careful we don't do that. The next thing I want to talk about is something called set index. Now, for now, let's actually go ahead and delete the second div box that I created. We're also going to go ahead and delete the floats just to have everything look normal inside the browser. So we're just going to go ahead and go back in here, refresh. Now, set index is going to be one that determines which content goes behind one another. So in some cases, when we use something called position in order to style things inside using CSS, which is basically where we take content and just like completely rip it out of the hierarchy and just place it somewhere inside the browser, then in those cases, we can actually go ahead and tell it which content needs to go behind and which ones needs to go in front. So we use something called set-index. And in this particular case here, you can just give it any kind of number. So let's say I want the text to be in the front. I can give it 100, just as an example. And I can copy paste this down to my box down here. And I could give it a lower number in order to make this actually go behind. Or I can give it a larger number, like 1,000, so it actually goes in front. And in this sort of way, we can tell it which content needs to go behind and in front of each other. Now, my notes does actually tell me to talk about position in this video here, but let's not do that because it's a pretty big subject in itself, at least compared to all the other ones we talked about. So let's go ahead and jump on to the next one, which is going to be how to create a border. So for example, inside this particular div box that we created here, I can say border. I can give it a color. So for example, we could say they want it to be blue. Then I could say I want it to be solid. And I could tell it I want it to be a certain size. So I could say 10 pixels. And just like this, if I were to go back inside the website, refresh, you can now see that we have a blue border. An important thing to note here is that it is adding 10 pixels to each side of the box. So if you need to fit this box inside a container that is the same height and width of this particular box here, it would actually go outside that container now, because right now we did actually add a 100 pixel width plus 10 pixels on one side plus 10 pixels on the other side. So we do have 120 pixels in width now with this border here, just to point that out. Now we do also have something called background image that we can use instead of background color, but we haven't talked about images yet. And we will get to talk about that once we do actually talk about the image HTML element. I will also talk about how we instead can create images using a div box and then inserting a background image instead, because there is some applications for that that are really useful inside a website. For example, if you want to do like mouse over hover, transition effects or something, then you can do that. But let's not talk about that in this video here. Another really dangerous one to show you is cursor. So if we were to write cursor, I can actually choose a particular cursor type when my mouse cursor goes on top of this element here. So I could, for example, say pointer. And that would actually make this particular box, because right now I can see it's just a regular, I don't know if you can tell, it's kind of tiny, but I just have the regular mouse icon. But if I were to refresh the browser, now I get the link icon. So we have this hand instead that is clicking on it. It's not doing anything, it's just changing the mouse cursor. This is, by the way, a really fun way if you want to have a unique mouse cursor for your entire website. You can actually just go ahead and add this styling to your entire website, and then you can have a unique mouse cursor to everything, just to mention it. We do also have something called display, and display is something that allows for us to make this content display as something specific. So for example, we can have it display as a block, which is actually going to make this it's going to make this an actual box. In some cases, for example, with text, we can actually go ahead and tell it to treat the text like a block. So we can add a background color and such things. We can also put things in line. So if we have text like a list of items, we can put them next to each other in a line. We can also go ahead and say we want to display none, which would actually make an item actually go in and disappear, because now we don't actually have it displayed inside the website. If we were to actually go ahead and inspect and go inside my inspector here, you can see that right now we can't actually highlight it. If I put my mouse cursor on it, you can see I can see the text in here, but when I go down to the div box, it's nowhere to be found. So basically, we're not actually having it inside the web page shown inside the browser, even though we have it inside the HTML of our website. Basically, we're ripping it out when it has to show it inside the browser, so it doesn't actually put it there. And this is something that is completely different from if I were to write visibility and set this one to hidden. So if I were to do this and go in here, refresh the browser, you can see it's still not in here, but now it is actually technically still in there. It's just not visible inside the page, but it hasn't been ripped out in the same sense. So it's still in there, and that's just kind of like a fun little difference between display none and visibility hidden, just in case you want to know how to do that inside a website. And with this, I think we have everything that I wanted to talk about specifically when it comes to styling in this video here. Like I said, I will have a separate video, for example, on how to create images, and that will include how to actually add a image to a container inside a website, like a background image, and how to actually, move it inside the container and do all that kind of thing. For now, I think this is good. This is a good start to get you into styling, and I will, of course, leave timestamps below so you can go back and forth and just kind of hear about the different types of styling. And do keep in mind, and this is very important to point out, if you look at this and you think to yourself, okay, I'm not going to be able to remember all of this. Like, this is just way too much. Like, do I expect you to know all of this right now? No, I do not. This is something that takes practice in order to actually memorize inside your head, because this is a lot of things to remember in just one video. And of course I don't, because this is a lot of information. The only way you're going to be learning all these is by doing it again and again and again inside websites. So over time, as you use these stylings, they will of course stick to your brain, but don't expect to just watch this video one time and then I expect you to know all these things here, because of course that's not how it works. Anything gets memorized through repetition. So with that, this is how you can add styling to your website. And of course, there is many more pieces of styling that I didn't share with you, but this is like the most essential ones that you will be using over and over again. So with that said, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you guys next time.